When did your dad's happiness come at the cost of your own? I was getting ready for my boyfriend's and I's anniversary when he suddenly texted saying he needed time to work on himself. I sighed. He was the third boyfriend in the last year who had broken up with me on our 3-month anniversary. My roommate found me sitting on my bed hitting a vape. Let me guess, Jack just ended it? I nodded, showing her my phone. Blocked on Instagram, WhatsApp, everything. Maybe you're cursed, she joked, but I didn't laugh. And when I told my dad, he seemed weirdly relieved, just like he had with the others. When I started going out with Igor, my fourth boyfriend, I made sure to journal about every little thing we did together. I forced myself to have an avoidant attachment style and let him chase me. And on our 3-month, it happened again. I need to work on myself. Blocked everywhere. He transferred schools the next week. For BF number 5, I went extreme and changed my entire look. Dyed my brown hair blonde, bought a whole new wardrobe, even changed my makeup style thinking maybe I was clapped. We were halfway through our 3-month anniversary picnic when he looked down at his phone and his face went white. I need to work on myself. You aren't the one for me, he said, like it was recited. By Monday, his friends were literally crossing the street to avoid me. One of them looked genuinely scared when he saw me, muttering something about not wanting trouble. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. A year later, when I was finally ready to date again, I decided not to sleep with him at all, and didn't even introduce him to my family or friends. I went for the whole mysterious girl thing, and kept everything surface level. 3 months hit and he sent the text while we were supposed to be at the movies. I need to work on myself. Sorry. He was gone from campus within 3 days. When I cried to my mom about it, she just patted my shoulder and said, the right one will come along when it's time. There I was, age 26 on a date with boyfriend number 9 when I saw Connor, my very first boyfriend, walk in. When he saw me with Merrick, his face drained of color like he was heartbroken. He started to slowly walk over. I really did love you, he said quietly, not even looking at Marek. Then why did you leave? I asked. I'd wanted to ask this question for years. He started to answer. It wasn't me, your dad. He then stopped completely, his face going white and practically ran out of the shop. Marek asked who that was, and I just shrugged, not wanting him to think I was hung up on the past. But after Marek broke up with me, I tried to delve deeper. I got a therapist and begged her to tell me whether or not I had daddy issues, but she promised I was perfectly healthy. When I finally met Ash, I didn't even want to date him, but he was persistent and sweet. He showed up at places I'd be, always knowing my schedule somehow. On our 3-month anniversary when he looked down at his phone, I was ready for the script. Let me guess. You need to work on yourself. Hey, he interrupted, not listening to me. Look at this funny video of a dog purring like a cat. I breathed a sigh of relief. The rest of the month came and went. Month 4 passed, then 5. My parents kept asking about him, more interested than they'd ever been in any boyfriend. So by month 6, I felt safe enough to send a photo of him to the family group chat. Everyone responded super happy for me. And my dad just said, glad you finally came to your senses. The next week it was Dad's birthday, just immediate family, and they insisted I bring him. But halfway through, Mom did something unforgivable. She tried to embarrass me with old baby photos. But I noticed something. In every single photo, Christmas, Easter, every birthday party, there was the same little boy next to me. Oh my gosh, I laughed, looking closer. He looks exactly like Ash. That's so weird. Dad smiled this strange smile. Well, it makes sense. That's the boy we've wanted you with all along. Mom added. Finally, the plan worked. The entire room went cold. What plan? I asked, voice shaking. They looked at each other. Dad cleared his throat. Your mother and I planned this relationship with Uncle Aman and Aunt Priya when you were babies. My stomach dropped. Uncle Aman? Why would Uncle Aman care who I date? Dad flipped to a page labeled Future Couple in gold letters. Dozens of photos of me and that little boy at every holiday, every family vacation. That's Ash, I whispered. Of course. It's Aman and Anya's son. Your cousin, Dad said simply. The room started spinning. You two have been promised since birth. It's important to keep the business in the family, just like our parents did. I looked at Ash sitting next to me. He just sat there, completely nonchalant. You knew? For about a month now, he admitted. But we're barely related, and it's completely legal in this state. I'd already fallen for you by then. Dad nodded like this was all perfectly normal. Your mother and I are second cousins too. It's how we keep the family business protected. I just smiled. Not because I wasn't disgusted. I absolutely was. But because I had an ace up my sleeve. And I was ready to make them pay. I kept my smile frozen in place while Dad went on about family traditions and Mom served dessert, my phone recording everything from my pocket where I'd started it right after the big reveal. I asked Dad how long they'd been planning this, keeping my voice light and curious like I was just interested in the family history. He actually pulled out more photo albums, pointing to pictures from before I was even born where he and Uncle were shaking hands over some business deal, saying they'd promised their future kids would marry to keep everything in the family. Mom chimed in about how they'd picked my name to match with Ash's, both starting with A, and I made sure to lean closer so my phone would catch every word. Ash sat there eating cake like this was all totally normal, occasionally adding details about how his parents had shown him the same albums when he turned 25. I asked more questions, pretending to be warming up to the idea, getting them to explain exactly how they'd gotten rid of my other boyfriends. Dad actually laughed about the money he'd paid them, calling it small investments to protect the family plan. When dinner finally ended and Ash drove me home, I stayed quiet in the car, already planning my next moves. That night I couldn't sleep, so I opened my laptop and started building a timeline of every single boyfriend, pulling up old texts and emails I'd saved over the years. Jack's last message before blocking me was at 3:47 p.m. on our anniversary. Igor's was at 8:22 p.m., and when I checked my dad's call logs from those days, he'd called unknown numbers right before each breakup. I found patterns in my old Instagram posts, too, where Dad would comment asking about my boyfriends just days before they'd leave. The timeline grew into something that looked like those conspiracy boards you see in movies, with dates and connections everywhere, and I screenshot everything multiple times to different cloud accounts. I went through my email trash and found receipts for restaurants where I'd had dates, then cross-referenced them with my parents' credit card statements they'd left logged in on the family computer. 3 times Dad had been at the same restaurants, different tables but close enough to watch, and the charges showed up within minutes of mine. By 4 in the morning, I had enough evidence to show this wasn't coincidence, and I saved it all to multiple USB drives I hid around my apartment. The next morning, Connor's face kept flashing in my mind, how scared he'd looked when he tried to tell me about Dad, so I searched his name online and found him working at a marketing firm downtown. His LinkedIn showed he'd been promoted twice since our breakup, and his profile picture had him smiling, but his eyes looked tired. I wrote and rewrote a message 10 times before sending a simple request to meet for coffee, saying I'd learned some things about why we broke up and wanted to talk. He read it within minutes but didn't respond for 3 hours, then finally sent back just an address and time for tomorrow. I spent the rest of the morning going through my old journals, finding notes I'd written about each relationship that suddenly made more sense. Dad had asked weirdly specific questions before each breakup, things like what restaurants we were going to or what movies we were seeing, and Mom always had that same relieved expression when things ended, which I'd drawn little sketches of without realizing the pattern. There were pages where I'd written about feeling watched on dates, dismissing it as paranoia, but now I knew it was real. My journal from Igor's time had a whole entry about Dad randomly showing up at our study spot at the library, claiming he was there for business research. The journal from boyfriend number 5 mentioned Mom accidentally running into us at the mall 3 times in 1 week. Every red flag I'd ignored was right there in my own handwriting, and I photographed every single page. I opened Ash's Facebook and Instagram, scrolling back years through his activity, and my stomach turned when I saw he'd been liking my posts since I was in college. Comments on photos from 5 years ago, always friendly but persistent, reactions to every major life update I'd posted. He'd even commented on my graduation photos saying, "Can't wait to celebrate with you properly someday," which seemed creepy now that I knew he'd been waiting for his turn. His own posts barely mentioned other girls, just a few group photos, but he'd shared every single family business update that involved both our families. I called my therapist's emergency line and got an appointment for that afternoon, bringing a folder thick with all my documentation. She read through everything while I sat there shaking, her face getting more serious with each page. When she finally looked up, she said this level of coordination suggested serious control issues and possibly criminal harassment, then handed me a business card for an attorney named Deborah, who specialized in family harassment cases. She made me promise to be careful and document everything going forward, saying this was beyond normal family pressure. After leaving therapy, I sat in my car and set up automatic cloud backups for my phone recordings, making sure everything would save to 3 different accounts. I downloaded a recording app that could run in the background without showing any notification, testing it twice to make sure it worked perfectly. I also turned on location tracking for myself, creating a record of everywhere I went and set up a separate email account just for storing evidence. That weekend, I waited until my parents posted on Facebook about being at their golf club, then drove to their house using the spare key they didn't know I still had. The photo albums were right where Dad had left them, and I photographed every single page of the one labeled Future Couple in gold letters. There were pictures of baby me and baby Ash in matching outfits, notes in the margins about keeping the bloodline pure and securing the business future, and even a family tree showing how all the cousin marriages had kept the money in the family for generations. One page had a timeline of when we were supposed to meet, marry, and have kids, with specific years marked for each milestone. I found more albums showing every family vacation where they'd made sure Ash and I were together, posed like a little couple even as toddlers. Monday morning came and I tested my theory about Ash tracking me by casually mentioning over breakfast that I was thinking about a job offer in another city. His coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth and he immediately said my dad wouldn't approve, then tried to cover by saying he meant we wouldn't want to leave our families. I pushed a little more, saying it was a great opportunity, and watched him pull out his phone to text someone while pretending to check the weather. 10 minutes later, Dad called asking about my job plans, proving they were definitely coordinating. I told Ash I was going to the gym after work, but drove to the library instead, parking where I could see the entrance from inside. My phone stayed silent for exactly 20 minutes. Then Ash texted asking why I wasn't at the gym, adding that he'd thought about surprising me with a protein shake. There was no way he could know I wasn't there unless someone was tracking my location, so I screenshot his message with the timestamp and my actual location tag from the library. 20 minutes later, I heard the library door open and saw Ash walking in, looking around like he was lost, and when he spotted me, his whole face lit up with fake surprise. He walked over carrying nothing, no books, no bag, just his phone in his hand, and said he was just returning a book he'd forgotten at home. I smiled and took a picture of us together, making sure the timestamp showed 3:47 p.m., then watched him pretend to look for books in the philosophy section where he'd never been in his life. He kept glancing at me every few seconds, checking if I was still there, so I packed up slowly and told him I was heading home. The second I got to my car, I texted Connor from my old number asking if we could meet somewhere public, and he replied within minutes suggesting the downtown coffee shop on Main Street. 3 days later, I got there 40 minutes early and picked a corner table where I could see everything, setting up my phone against the sugar dispenser to record the whole entrance area. Connor walked in looking like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes, shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavy, and when he sat down, his hands were shaking. He looked around the coffee shop twice before leaning forward and telling me Dad had shown up at his office the day after we broke up, just standing there in the lobby when Connor got to work. Dad had smiled that same cold smile and said Connor's company did business with his firm, mentioned how contracts could be reviewed, partnerships reconsidered, all while never actually threatening anything directly. Connor pulled out his phone and showed me screenshots of text from a blocked number that came right after, messages about his parents' mortgage application at a bank Dad had connections with, how these things needed careful consideration, how young people sometimes made choices that affected their whole families. The messages were vague enough to avoid being illegal, but clear enough to be terrifying, and Connor said he'd transferred schools within a week because he couldn't risk his family's home. My therapist's office felt colder when I showed her everything the next week, and she stopped taking notes halfway through to really look at me. She said this went beyond normal family pressure into something that could be criminal, that stalking and harassment laws existed for exactly these situations, and she pulled out her phone right there to call someone. Deborah Roberts could see me that afternoon if I could get there by 3, and my therapist said Deborah specialized in cases where families used money and power to control their children. The law office was in a plain building downtown, nothing fancy, and Deborah turned out to be this small woman with gray hair who looked like she could be someone's grandma until she started talking. She spread out my evidence on her conference table and started explaining stalking laws, how repeated unwanted contact becomes harassment, how conspiracy charges work when multiple people coordinate to interfere with someone's life. She showed me examples of restraining orders she'd gotten for other clients, warned me about defamation risks if we went public without solid proof, explained how rich families often used lawsuits to silence victims even when they were guilty. She said we needed more evidence, specifically proof of the tracking, documentation of the coordination between family members and witnesses willing to testify. That night, I called Bridger from college, remembering how he'd helped everyone fix their laptops and recover lost data, and asked if he could check my devices for tracking software. He came over the next day with a whole bag of cables and scanners, started with my phone, found 3 different tracking apps hidden in system folders, then moved to my laptop where he found keyloggers that had been installed years ago. My car had a GPS tracker under the bumper that looked like it belonged there, professional-grade stuff that probably cost thousands, and Bridger documented everything with screenshots and photos. He was going through my Google account settings when he stopped and stared at the screen, then turned the laptop toward me to show that my calendar had been shared with an email address I didn't recognize. The email was linked to Dad's company domain, but hidden behind a generic name, and when Bridger checked the sharing history, it went back 6 years. Every appointment, every class schedule, every date I'd ever put in my calendar visible to whoever had that account. He showed me logs of when the calendar had been accessed, hundreds of times, always right before Ash would randomly show up places, and the pattern was so clear it made me sick. Mom was making dinner when I went to my parents' house that weekend, and I tried to casually mention that I'd been thinking about privacy lately, maybe getting a new phone number, being more careful with my information. She laughed and waved her spatula at me, said privacy was a modern invention that broke up families, that in her generation everyone knew everyone's business, and that's how they kept each other safe. She actually used those exact words, "It's for your own safety," like she was reading from a script, and when I pushed a little more she got defensive and said this was how their family had always done things. The invitation to dinner at Uncle and Aunt's house came through Ash the next day, and I accepted immediately, making sure my phone was fully charged and testing the recording app twice before we left. The whole drive there, Ash kept talking about how excited his parents were, how they'd been waiting for this for so long, and I just nodded and smiled while my phone recorded everything from my pocket. Their house was bigger than I remembered, and they'd set the dining room table with the good china, candles everywhere like this was some special occasion. Uncle kept refilling my wine glass while talking about family obligations, bloodlines, how important it was to keep money and power concentrated, how I should be grateful to be was chosen for such an important role. Aunt nodded along, adding comments about the babies we'd have, how they'd already picked names, planned which schools they'd attend, and neither of them seemed to notice how insane they sounded. They had a whole timeline planned out, when we'd get married, when I'd stop working to focus on family, when we'd take over parts of the business, and they discussed my life like I was a character in a story they were writing. The campus advisor agreed to meet me at a Starbucks near the university, and she looked nervous the whole time, kept checking over her shoulder like someone might be watching. She couldn't say anything officially, legal liability and all that, but she suggested I look at the timing of certain administrative decisions and donations to the school. She mentioned that donor families sometimes had unusual influence over student transfers, that paperwork could be expedited when large sums were involved, and that my father's name appeared on several buildings for a reason. When I got home that night, I had emails from two of my ex-boyfriend's friends, both saying they'd heard I was asking questions and wanted to help, that they'd seen things that didn't make sense at the time but did now. The next morning, Connor's name popped up on my phone with a text that just said, "Check your email," and when I opened it, there were 3 screenshots attached. The first showed a Zelle payment for $8,000 from something called Meridian Holdings LLC, dated the day after our breakup with consultation fee in the memo line. The second screenshot was his student loan statement from that month showing he owed exactly $8,012. The third was just him saying, "I'm sorry," over and over. I forwarded everything to Bridger, who'd been helping me dig into Dad's business connections, and within 2 hours he texted back that he'd found something big. We met at a coffee shop downtown where he opened his laptop and showed me the state business registry website with Meridian Holdings LLC pulled up. The registered agent was listed as the same law firm Dad used for all his corporate deals, and when Bridger clicked through to the firm's website, there was Dad's smiling face on the partners page listed as their biggest client. He'd traced 5 more LLCs with similar generic names, all registered through the same firm, and all created within days of my various breakups. I took pictures of everything on my phone while Bridger made copies of the public records and saved them to multiple cloud accounts just in case. That weekend, I decided to test just how deep the surveillance went by texting Ash that I was meeting a coworker named Jaden for coffee on Sunday at the place near the park. I didn't actually have a coworker named Jaden, but I waited at the coffee shop anyway with my phone recording video from the table. Sure enough, 3 minutes after I'd sent the text to Ash, my parents walked in looking around like they were surprised to see me there. Mom waved and came over asking what I was doing there alone, and I said I was waiting for someone from work. Dad kept checking his phone and looking at the door while Mom made small talk about the weather and asked if I wanted to join them instead. I said no thanks and kept recording as they sat at a table with a perfect view of mine, Dad positioning himself to watch the entrance. They stayed for 45 minutes nursing the same drinks until I finally left, and I could see Dad texting someone as I walked out. Monday morning, I was at my desk when the receptionist called to say someone had a delivery for me, and I walked out to find Ash standing there with a huge bouquet of roses. He smiled and said, "Your dad mentioned you haven't been answering his calls and he's worried about you," which was weird since I hadn't told anyone I'd been ignoring Dad's calls for the past 3 days. I took the flowers and thanked him coldly, then went straight back to my desk and documented the whole thing in the file I was building. After work, I drove to Deborah's office where she reviewed everything I'd collected so far, spreading the printouts across her conference table and making notes on a legal pad. She explained that we definitely had enough for a harassment restraining order, but warned that defamation lawsuits were expensive to defend even when you were telling the truth. She suggested we focus on building an airtight case with multiple witnesses and documented evidence before taking any legal action, because once we filed anything, it would escalate quickly. Connor agreed to meet with her the next day and sign a notarized statement about Dad's threats, though he insisted his name be kept confidential in any public proceedings, since he was genuinely scared of what Dad might do to his career. While I was sitting in Deborah's waiting room afterward, my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from someone I didn't recognize who turned out to be a friend of boyfriend number 5. He said he'd heard I was asking questions about what happened back then and wanted me to know the truth about why everyone suddenly avoided me. He sent screenshots of a group chat from right after the breakup, where someone was spreading rumors that I was unstable and dangerous, and warning people to stay away from me for their own safety. The messages got worse as I scrolled, claiming I'd threatened my ex and his family, that I had mental health issues, that I was obsessed and wouldn't leave him alone, none of which was true. The person spreading the rumors was using a fake account, but they knew details only someone close to my family would know. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I decided to pull my credit report to see if there were any other surprises, and what I found made me feel sick. There were 3 credit cards opened when I was 16, 2 store cards from when I was 18, and a line of credit from when I was 21, all showing my parents as authorized users with full access. The addresses on file included properties I'd never lived at, and the spending patterns showed thousands in charges I'd never made. The pattern went back over a decade with my parents maintaining complete financial control through accounts I didn't even know existed. 2 days later, Mom showed up at my apartment unannounced with containers of homemade food and a gift bag that she insisted I open right away. Inside was a silver bracelet I recognized from childhood photos, one she said had been in the family for generations, and that I should wear for tradition. She clasped it on my wrist before I could protest, going on about how important family traditions were and how proud she was that I was finally understanding my place in the family. The bracelet felt heavy and wrong, but I smiled and thanked her while mentally adding this visit to my documentation. I met Ursula the journalist at a diner across town where she listened to my story and reviewed the evidence I'd brought, taking notes and asking follow-up questions about dates and names. She explained that she was definitely interested, but would need more sources willing to go on record, and suggested I reach out to more of my exes to see if any would corroborate the pattern of interference. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Ash, and when I opened it, my blood ran cold because it was a photo of him standing outside the coffee shop on 3rd Street with the caption, "Where are you, babe?" Which was weird because I'd decided last minute not to go there after all and had never told him about those plans. I screenshot the message immediately and added it to my growing folder of evidence while my hands shook because this proved he was getting my location from someone else, probably my parents who still had access to my calendar. I called Deborah right away and she told me to come to her office that afternoon so we could start the paperwork for a restraining order, and when I got there, she had me go through every single piece of documentation I'd collected, while her assistant made copies of everything. The stack of evidence was getting thick with screenshots, recordings, witness statements from Connor, and now this latest proof that Ash was tracking me through methods I hadn't even given him access to. Deborah explained the process would take time, but with everything we had documented, she felt confident a judge would grant at least a temporary order. And she walked me through what to expect at the hearing while I signed form after form until my hand cramped. Back at my apartment, my roommate was waiting with her own notebook where she'd already started writing down every time Ash had shown up uninvited over the past few months, and she promised to testify if needed because she'd been getting bad vibes from him since day one. She showed me entries going back weeks with dates and times when Ash would just appear at our door claiming he was in the neighborhood or bringing food I hadn't asked for, always when I wasn't expecting him. That evening, Bridger came over with his laptop and asked to check all my devices for tracking software, and within 20 minutes he found something disturbing on my phone that made him frown and call me over to look at the screen. There was an old iPad still logged into my parents' Apple family account that was actively syncing with my iCloud, which meant they could see my calendar, contacts, photos, basically everything I did on my phone for who knows how long. Bridger helped me change all my passwords and secure my accounts, but made sure to document everything first, taking screenshots of the sync history that showed this had been going on for years without my knowledge. He pulled up the iPad's location, and it was at my parents' house, listed as Family iPad in their device list, and when he clicked on it, we could see it had been accessing my data as recently as that morning. On a hunch, I asked him to check what else was on that iPad, and that's when we found it. A shared calendar called Future Couple Planning, with color-coded entries going back to when I was in college. The calendar had reminders like, introduce Ash at Farmer's Market, and arrange Connor breakup week 12, and Igor transfer paperwork deadline, with notes about each of my relationships and when to interfere with them. My stomach turned as I scrolled through years of my dating life laid out like a business plan, with quarterly goals and success metrics tracking how close they were to getting me with Ash. I took photos of everything with Bridger's phone since mine was compromised, and then I did something I'd been avoiding. I called Dad directly to confront him about the calendar. His voice was calm at first as he tried to spin it as normal parental concern for my safety. But when I mentioned the words legal action, his tone went ice cold, and he reminded me that I was still on their insurance, their phone plan, and they'd co-signed my apartment lease. He said family takes care of family, and I shouldn't forget who had supported me all these years, then hung up before I could respond. The next day, Deborah called me with strict instructions to keep all communication with my family in writing from now on. No phone calls, no in-person meetings unless I was recording, nothing that could be twisted into me being the aggressor. She'd seen cases like this go sideways when the person with money and connections painted themselves as the victim, and she wanted to make sure we stayed ahead of any potential countermoves. Meanwhile, Ursula had been working her journalism contacts and texted me that she'd found a former university administrator who was willing to talk off the record about donor families influencing student transfers and expulsions. We met at a park where the administrator, who asked not to be named, confirmed that wealthy families had definitely pressured the school to remove problematic students before, especially when those students were dating someone the family didn't approve of. The administrator couldn't give specific names but said the pattern was clear if you knew where to look in the transfer records and donation timings. 2 days later, Ash started texting constantly about needing to meet face-to-face to work things out and clear up misunderstandings, and after discussing it with Deborah, I agreed, but only if I could bring someone and record everything. I asked my roommate to come but stay at a nearby table, and I set up my phone to record before Ash arrived at the coffee shop we'd chosen as neutral ground. He sat down across from me with this sad expression like he was the victim here, and started talking about how this whole situation had gotten out of hand and we could work through it together if I just stopped involving outsiders. I kept my voice steady and asked him directly how he knew where to accidentally run into me all those times, and watched his face change as he realized I knew everything. He admitted that yes, Dad had told him where I'd be and when, giving him my schedule and suggesting the best times to show up, but he insisted it was just to help things along because he really did love me. He actually said the words, "I fell for you despite the arrangement," like that made the stalking and manipulation okay, like violating my privacy for months was romantic instead of criminal. His inability to see why this was wrong, the way he kept saying we were meant to be together, and the family just helped fade along, made me realize how deep this sickness ran in both our families and how lucky I was to be getting out now. My phone started buzzing the second I got home from that coffee shop meeting with Ash, Mom's picture lighting up the screen over and over until I finally answered on the 5th call. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first, just catching bits about how going public would destroy everything the family built, how their reputation would be ruined, how the business partners would pull out and leave us with nothing. I sat on my couch listening to her sob about legacy and tradition and family honor, while I recorded the whole thing on my laptop, watching the sound waves spike with each desperate plea for me to handle this privately, to think about the family name, to remember all they'd done for me. The tears sounded real enough, but when she said we could work something out just between us, I knew it was still about protecting their reputation, not about what they'd done to me. After 20 minutes of her crying and begging, I told her I needed time to think and hung up, then immediately forwarded the recording to Deborah, who texted back that this was perfect evidence of them acknowledging wrongdoing. Connor messaged me an hour later with another screenshot that made my hands shake. A Zelle payment from that same LLC with a memo line that actually said, "Appreciation for discretion," dated the week after our breakup. The amount was $10,000, way more than I'd expected, and when I zoomed in on the screenshot, I could see the payment came from an account ending in the same numbers as the one on Dad's business checks I'd seen growing up. I sent it straight to Deborah, who called me immediately saying this was the smoking gun we needed. Actual written proof that Dad was paying people to stay quiet about breaking up with me. Meanwhile, Bridger had been digging through public records all morning and texted me that he'd found the registered agent for the LLC. And sure enough, it was the exact same law firm that handles all of Dad's corporate stuff, the one with their name on a big building downtown. He sent me screenshots of the state filing documents showing the connection was right there in black and white for anyone who knew where to look. Completely undeniable proof that Dad controlled the company making these payments. I spent the rest of that day organizing everything into a massive folder for the restraining order filing, printing out every screenshot, every recording transcript, every witness statement from Connor and my roommate, and even that scared friend of boyfriend number 5. The stack of papers was almost 2 inches thick by the time I finished, heavy enough that I needed both hands to carry it to Deborah's office, where she helped me fill out the supplemental filing forms. 3 days later, a courier showed up at my apartment with an official-looking envelope from Hartley, Brennan & Associates, Dad's law firm, containing a cease and desist letter that accused me of harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress on the family. The letter threatened legal action if I continued to spread what they called false and malicious allegations, and demanded I retract any statements I'd made to third parties about the family's private matters. Deborah laughed when I forwarded it to her, saying it was a classic intimidation tactic that actually showed they were worried, because if they really thought they could win, they'd have just filed the lawsuit instead of threatening it. She spent 2 days crafting a response that refused all their demands and laid out potential criminal charges for stalking, harassment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of privacy rights, making sure to mention the state's anti-SLAPP protections that would make them pay my legal fees if they tried to use a lawsuit to shut me up. The response was beautiful in its controlled aggression, professionally telling them to back off while making it clear we had enough evidence to bury them if they pushed this. 4 days after Deborah sent that letter, I tried to buy groceries and my debit card got declined, which made no sense since I'd just gotten paid from my freelance work. When I checked my banking app, I discovered my parents had frozen the joint account they'd had access to since I was 18, the one where my paychecks had been going for years because I'd never bothered to change it. There was $8,000 in there that I couldn't touch, and when I called the bank, they said both account holders had to agree to unfreeze it, which meant I was completely screwed for rent that was due in 5 days. My roommate found me sitting on the kitchen floor, stress-eating cereal straight from the box, and immediately offered to cover my half while I figured things out, not even hesitating when I explained what was happening. I picked up 3 new freelance projects that week, working until my eyes burned just to make enough to pay her back and cover next month, the financial pressure making everything else even harder to deal with. Ursula had been working her contacts at the university and called me excited, because she'd found a second administrator who was willing to go on record about donor families influencing student transfers, someone who'd actually processed the paperwork when 2 of my ex-boyfriends suddenly left school. This person had dates, donation amounts, and even emails discussing how to handle the transfers diplomatically. Enough verification that even the best lawyers couldn't claim the story was made up. While all this was happening, Ash kept texting me these long, rambling messages mixing apologies with justifications, saying he was just following family tradition, that arranged marriages weren't that weird in lots of cultures, that he really did love me despite how it started. Each text was more desperate than the last, talking about destiny and fate and how we were meant to be together, how the family just helped speed up what would have happened naturally anyway. I didn't respond to any of them but screenshot every single message and forwarded them to Deborah for the legal file, making sure to save multiple backups in case my phone mysteriously stopped working like I was starting to worry it might. Deborah called me the next morning to start prepping for the restraining order hearing, and I spent the whole day at her office going through every piece of evidence we'd collected. She had me practice answering questions while she played the opposing lawyer, drilling me on dates and times and making sure I could explain everything without getting emotional or flustered. We organized all the screenshots into labeled folders and printed 3 copies of everything. One for us, one for the judge, and one for Ash's legal team. She taught me how to sit, where to look, how to speak clearly into the microphone, and most importantly, how to stay calm when they tried to make me look crazy or vindictive. By the time we finished, it was past midnight and my brain was fried, but I felt ready to face whatever they threw at me. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, and I barely slept the night before, running through everything in my head and double-checking that all my evidence was in order. I got to the courthouse an hour early and sat in my car practicing my breathing exercises while watching other people walk in for their own battles. When I finally went inside, Ash was already there with 2 lawyers in expensive suits, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom and avoiding eye contact completely. The judge was an older woman who looked tired but sharp, scanning through paperwork while we all got settled into our places. Deborah squeezed my shoulder before we started, and I took the stand, my hands shaking slightly as I placed them on the Bible to swear in. I testified for almost an hour, walking through the synchronized calendars, the tracking software Bridger found, the way Ash always knew where I was even when I lied about my location. Ash's lawyer kept interrupting to object, calling everything circumstantial and suggesting I was misinterpreting normal family concern as something sinister. He actually used the phrase close-knit family dynamics about 15 times, trying to make stalking sound like love. When he cross-examined me, he pulled up social media posts where I'd tagged my location, claiming Ash could have found me that way without any tracking. But Deborah had prepared me for this, and I calmly explained the times I'd deliberately not posted anything, and Ash still showed up, like when I'd decided last minute to study at a coffee shop I'd never been to before. The judge started asking her own questions, particularly interested in the shared calendar titled Future Couple Planning, with reminders about interfering in my relationships. Connor's notarized statement was entered into evidence, and the judge read it carefully, her eyebrows raising at the part about Dad paying him to disappear. She looked at the bank records showing the LLC payments to my exes and asked Ash's lawyers to explain how that was normal family behavior. They tried to argue the payments were unrelated business transactions, but couldn't provide any documentation about what services were supposedly rendered. After 3 hours of testimony and arguments, the judge called a recess to review everything and make her decision. Those 20 minutes felt like hours as I sat in the hallway with Deborah, too nervous to eat the granola bar she offered me. When we went back in, the judge granted a limited restraining order requiring Ash to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace. It wasn't the full no-contact order we'd wanted since she said family situations were complicated, but it was legally binding protection that would result in his arrest if he violated it. As we left the courtroom, I felt this mix of relief and exhaustion wash over me, finally having some legal protection after months of feeling hunted. Dad was waiting outside on the courthouse steps, standing just far enough away to not violate any laws but close enough that I couldn't avoid him. His face was controlled, but I could see the anger in his jaw, the way he clenched and unclenched his fists while maintaining that fake pleasant expression. He didn't yell or make threats, just spoke in this low, measured voice about how disappointed he was and how I was destroying everything our grandparents built. He reminded me that my trust fund had conditions, that the family business had bylaws about conduct unbecoming of an heir, that there were consequences for betraying family. The words were careful, nothing that could be considered a legal threat, but the message was clear as he talked about how hard it would be to make it on my own without family support. I recorded the whole thing on my phone in my pocket, making sure to capture his barely contained rage and the way he mentioned my future prospects, with this ominous tone. That afternoon, Deborah helped me draft a formal demand letter to send to Dad, laying out exactly what we wanted to make this stop. We demanded he cease all interference in my personal life, notify all my ex-boyfriends that any agreements or threats were nullified, and cover all my therapy and legal costs from dealing with years of manipulation. It was aggressive and comprehensive, including a timeline for compliance and consequences if he refused, basically threatening to pursue criminal charges for stalking and conspiracy. 2 days later, Dad's lawyer sent back a settlement offer that made my jaw drop, a mid-six-figure sum that would set me up for years. But it came with strings attached, requiring me to sign an NDA about everything, agree to never discuss the family publicly, and include language saying there was no admission of wrongdoing on their part. The money was tempting since I was still struggling financially, but signing would mean they could keep doing this to other family members, maybe cousins or future generations. I spent hours in therapy that week processing the grief of realizing the family I thought I had never really existed, that their love always had conditions and control attached to it. My therapist helped me work through the anger and sadness while strengthening my resolve to maintain boundaries, even though it meant losing my entire extended family. The sessions were brutal, bringing up childhood memories that looked different now, birthday parties and holidays that were actually networking events for future arranged marriages. Meanwhile, Ursula had been working with her editor and legal team to finalize the article, making strategic redactions to avoid defamation while keeping the core story intact. We went through multiple drafts, removing identifying details about the business while keeping enough specifics that people would understand this wasn't fiction. She interviewed 3 experts on coercive control and family abuse, who provided context about how common these situations are in wealthy families. We agreed on a publication date 2 weeks out, giving me time to prepare emotionally and practically for whatever backlash would come. I warned my roommate, my employer, and the few friends I trusted completely, making sure they understood things might get messy once the story went public. The morning the article went live, I turned off my phone and went to a movie, not wanting to watch it spread in real time. When I turned my phone back on 3 hours later, I had over 200 messages, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and notifications from every social media platform. The story had already been shared thousands of times locally, with people recognizing the family business name even though we'd been careful not to state it directly. Some messages were supportive, people sharing their own stories of controlling families or thanking me for speaking out about something usually kept quiet. Others were angry, accusing me of being ungrateful, of airing dirty laundry, of trying to destroy a successful family business over petty grievances. Several relatives I hadn't heard from in years reached out with their own stories. Cousins who'd been pushed into marriages or career paths. Aunts who'd been cut off for refusing to comply. Uncle called me a traitor in a voicemail, but his wife, my aunt, secretly texted me that she was proud of me for breaking the cycle. Dad's business partners started calling his office with questions, uncomfortable about being associated with someone who would manipulate his own daughter this way. The local business journal picked up the story, framing it as a question about ethics in family enterprises, and suddenly Dad was having to do damage control with investors and clients. 2 weeks passed before I heard anything from Ash or his parents, and when the letter came, it was exactly what Deborah predicted it would be. The envelope had their lawyer's return address, and inside was this super formal apology that basically said nothing while using a lot of big legal words. They were sorry for any misunderstandings, and hoped we could all move forward positively, but never actually admitted to doing anything wrong. Ash stayed completely away from my apartment and work, which was good because I was still jumpy every time I saw someone who looked like him from behind. His parents sent flowers to my office with a card that just said, "Thinking of you," which went straight into the trash. Meanwhile, Dad's company put out this weird press release that talked about respecting family privacy during personal matters, without actually saying what those matters were. The local business journal ran a follow-up story anyway, and suddenly 3 of Dad's biggest clients announced they were exploring other options for their contracts next year. One of them even called me directly to say they supported me, and couldn't work with someone who treated family that way. I spent the next month applying for jobs everywhere that had zero connection to my family's business network. The interviews were hard because everyone wanted to know why I was leaving my current position, and I had to be careful about what I said. Finally, this small marketing company downtown offered me a position that paid about $15,000 less than my old job, but the owner had no idea who my family was, and that made it worth every penny I'd be losing. My first day there felt like stepping into a whole new world where nobody knew my last name or my family drama. Connor reached out through Facebook Messenger with this short message saying he was sorry for not fighting harder back then, and that he understood if I never wanted to talk to him again. I wrote back that I accepted his apology and wished him well in his life, knowing we both needed to close that chapter completely. He liked the message but didn't respond, and I knew that was the end of it. Mom asked to meet for coffee one last time at this little place near the courthouse where we used to go when I was in high school. She looked older than I remembered, like the stress of everything had aged her 5 years in just a few months. She talked for 20 minutes about how scared she'd been of losing the family business, and how her parents had done the same thing to her, and she thought it was just how things worked. She couldn't actually say the words, "I'm sorry," though, just kept saying she wished things had been different. We hugged goodbye, knowing we'd probably never have coffee together again. I found a tiny studio apartment on the other side of town that was barely 500 square feet, but it was mine, paid for with my new job's salary and nothing from my family. The day I moved in, I found that childhood bracelet Mom had given me and put it in the back of a drawer I rarely opened, not ready to throw it away, but not wanting to see it either. My last therapy session was mostly just me talking about everything that had happened while my therapist listened and took notes. She asked what I thought my ace up my sleeve had really been, and I realized it wasn't about revenge or destroying them, but about documenting everything so thoroughly that I could protect myself and maybe help other people in similar situations. The truth was my best weapon, because it was the one thing they couldn't argue with or buy their way out of. That night, I posted a simple update on my private Instagram for the friends who'd been supporting me through everything. I wrote that I was safe, completely free from my family's manipulation, and taking a long break from dating to figure out who I actually was without their interference in my life. Hitting post on those words felt like the first real breath I'd taken in years, like I was finally allowed to just exist as myself without anyone pulling strings behind the scenes. That's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I really do love sharing these moments. Hope you carry a little of this good energy with you. If you want more, hit that subscribe button and come back soon.